Working at the intersection of technology and storytelling, Malik has a bachelor's degree in computer science from the University of Michigan and a master's degree in library and information sciences from the University of Illinois. He was previously the director of the Ranganathan Center for Digital Information at the University of Chicago Library. Our next speaker will be Johan Kugelberg, who is the founder of Boo-Hooray, which to date has placed over 120 significant cultural archives with museums and university libraries. He has taught at Yale and Cornell and is a faculty member at Rare Book School, where he teaches a yearly class. He's the author and editor of numerous books on subculture topics and regularly curates exhibits in museums and galleries around the world. And our final speaker will be Brian Weimer, who is a filmmaker living in Charlottesville. He has directed and produced 12 feature films, including Claw, the collective of lady arm wrestlers, and Pyrometheus. His latest film, Charlottesville, Our Streets, is an objective chronicle of the alt-right rally on August 12, 2017 in Charlottesville, composed of 40 interviews with eyewitnesses and compiling media from 20 sources. He's also co-founder of the Ix Art Park in Charlottesville, for which he currently serves as resident wizard. So we're gonna go ahead and start with Sumeet.
Hi. Oh, wow. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak from out here, if that's okay. I'm short, so these podiums are always taller than I am, so I just thought I would be out here. As Krystal mentioned, my name is Symposium Malik. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the South Asian American Digital Archive. Before I get started, I just want to thank Danielle and everyone else, Barbara, Holly, Krystal, everyone who both invited me to be here, but then also made such accommodations for me to be part of this panel. As you probably heard, I had some flight mishaps on the way here from Philadelphia, so I'm really glad to be here. And also want to thank Aisha for making space for me on this panel and going this morning in my place. So SADA is a national nonprofit organization based in Philadelphia, which is also where I live, but an organization that works to give voice to South Asian Americans by documenting, preserving, and sharing stories that reflect our community's unique and diverse experiences. So in my presentation today, I'll do two things. One is to give you some background on the organization and the work that we do, but the other is to talk more specifically about impact and how it is that as an organization, we think about the impact of the work that we do. But I'll start by giving you a little bit of context on the community that we serve. So our archive works to collect stories from those in the US who trace their heritage to Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and the many South Asian diaspora communities around the globe. So by that, what we mean are those who've come through perhaps secondary migration or tertiary migration to the Caribbean islands or Guyana or South Africa, UK, et cetera. If you do the math, you see that there are 3.4 million individuals in the US who trace their heritage to South Asia. It's actually South Asian Americans are the fastest growing immigrant community in the country in percentage terms. Between 2000 and 2010, the community grew by 81%. And if you do the math, you see that 1 in every 100 Americans traces their heritage to South Asia. In fact, these numbers are somewhat outdated. The latest census, of course, was in 2010. The next one is in 2020. So now I think the latest enumerations are that there are more than 4.3 million South Asians in the country. But to understand a little bit about the community, it's, of course, critical to understand a little bit about the community's history. South Asians began arriving in the United States in larger numbers beginning in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And those who came here at that time were coming primarily to work as laborers. So they're coming to work on farms and fields and lumber yards, mills, etc. And they're coming primarily from the Punjab region of British India. India was still, of course, then a British colony, and settling on the west coast of the United States, so in California, Oregon, Washington State, as well as in British Columbia and Canada. There were smaller numbers of individuals who were able to come for other reasons. So this is a photograph from 1914 of members of the Illinois chapter of the Hindustan Association of America. This is an organization that helped to acclimate students who were coming from South Asia, from India, to life in the United States. There were very, very few South Asian women who were allowed into the country in those early years of immigration from South Asia. This is a newspaper clipping from 1915 describing the arrival of one of the very few South Asian women in the country at that time. Her name is Kala Bagai. But as you can see, this newspaper article ignores her and talks about her nose ring. It says, "Nose diamond, latest fad, arrives here from India." But the reality for those early immigrants was that there was incredible opposition to their presence here in the United States, incredible xenophobia and racism targeting South Asians and Asians more broadly. This is an article, a newspaper article from around that time, as you can see, titled "Our First Invasion by Hindus and Mohammedans," and another titled "Have We a Dusky Peril? Hindu Hordes Invading the State." This newspaper article was published in Bellingham, Washington, a small town in Washington, where a group of Punjabi laborers had settled and were working in lumber yards there. And actually, just a few days after this article was published, there was a race riot, what we now call the Bellingham riot, where the group of Punjabi laborers were violently chased out of town by a group of white men. And there was also other kinds of legislation. There were judiciary decisions in place that helped to either implicitly or explicitly exclude South Asians from coming to the United States. And then finally, what happened in 1923 was there was a Supreme Court ruling, United States v. Bhagat Singh Thind, where it was decided unanimously by the Supreme Court that South Asians should be barred from becoming American citizens. This is a magazine article describing that Supreme Court decision titled "Hindus Too Brunette to Vote Here." And there's a photograph of a South Asian man with a caption that simply reads, quote unquote, "the problem." So that gives you a sense of the ethos in this country at that time. So I'll talk a little bit more about more recent immigration, but the work that SADA has been doing now for the last 10 years is to collect these stories of immigrants, of immigrant life in the United States, of South Asians, and make them accessible to everyone through our website and through the work that we do. This is a screenshot of our website. I'll give the URL at the end of the presentation, which I'd invite you to visit. But what's unique about our approach to doing this work is that SADA is what's called a post-custodial and digital-only archive. And what that means is that we're not seeking physical custody over any materials, but instead work closely with community members, community organizations, other archival institutions, and repositories, and use the power of the digital medium to provide access to and digitally preserve materials, allowing the originals to remain with whoever has them. So I'll turn now to just share with you one story from the archive, and through this story try to give you a sense of the incredible richness and diversity of South Asian American history, but also through the story begin to give you a sense of how it is that we go about doing this work of collecting these stories and how we think about their impact. And that's the story of someone named Dalip Singh Sond. This is a portrait of Dalip Sond. He was born in the late 1800s in the Punjab region of British India, so the same region that was the home for many of the early immigrants from South Asia. And though Dalip Sond, his parents hadn't really received a formal education, but they'd done well for themselves financially in agriculture and business in this village where Dalip Sond grew up with his siblings. And so even though his parents hadn't received an education formally, they were able to support their own children, Dalip Sond and his siblings, in pursuing their further studies. So he did an undergraduate degree in mathematics at a university in Punjab. And then in 1920, he had this opportunity to come to the United States to pursue his graduate studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Initially, his plan was that he was going to study agriculture. He was going to study fruit canning, actually, so he could go back to India and support his family in the business. But soon after arriving in Berkeley, he realized that his true love was for mathematics. He couldn't give that up. So he changed his major, and just 4 years after arriving in Berkeley in 1924, he graduated having completed both a master's and a PhD. But as I mentioned, just the year previous to this in 1923, the Supreme Court had ruled unanimously to bar South Asians from becoming American citizens. And so, of course, that meant a year later that Dalip Sond couldn't become an American citizen. And also because of local legislation in California, he couldn't own property, he couldn't marry outside of his race, and most pertinent and important to him at that very moment, it meant that he couldn't get a teaching job in his chosen profession in mathematics, despite being so highly qualified and having a PhD. So instead, what Dalip Sond did was move to Southern California and begin working as a farmer. He did lettuce farming and other kinds of farming for the next 20 plus years, but all the while continuing to be involved in community organizing work and really engaged in trying to support the South Asian community, that, as small as it was here in the United States at that point. Finally, after years and years of campaigning in 1946 by the community, South Asians were again allowed to become American citizens after more than 20 years of exclusion. And shortly after, Dalip Sond decided he was going to become a citizen, and then he was going to run for local office. So he ran for judgeship in this small town where he lived in California, and to his surprise, he was elected. And then a few years later, he decided he wasn't going to stop there, he was going to run for Congress. So in 1956, Dalip Sond ran for and was elected to Congress, becoming the first, not just South Asian American, but the first Asian American elected to national office in this country. I'm going to play for you now a short clip, just a couple minutes long, of an interview that was conducted with Congressman Sond in 1959. And in this interview, so he's been in office for 3 years now, he's asked about how it is that he came from such humble beginnings growing up in a small village in Punjab to becoming a US congressperson. And this is his response.
Now, in answer to your question, I had settled in Imperial County since 1926 as a farmer. I was a PhD in mathematics, but because I could not become a citizen of the United States, I could not find a teaching job. But I was satisfied as a farmer in the Imperial Valley, the only way I could make a living. While I was farming, I never let my interest in national and international affairs slow down. I was always interested in American political life. When I became a citizen of the United States on December 16, 1949, it was my ambition to run for public office. I ran for the office of Judge of the Justice Court of the small town where I had lived for 25 years. Everyone thought that I had no chance. It was not possible for a Hindu to be elected judge. But I had faith in the American sense of justice and fair play. I campaigned hard and I was elected. Then I was not allowed to sit because I had not been a citizen of the United States for 1 year. And I ran again in 1952 and I served as judge of the Justice Court for 4 years. In the meantime, in 1954, I had been elected as county chairman of the Democratic Central Committee of the County of Imperial. Then I had the opportunity to help in the campaign of the Democratic nominee for Congress in 1954. I became intrigued with that work. Then in 1956, I amazed everybody when I announced my candidacy. From then on, well, the story is well known. I lived in Imperial County, which has only 20% of the population of the district. And the larger county, Riverside, has 80% of the population. And to be frank with you, I did not know more than 12 persons in the Riverside County when I became a candidate. But it was simply amazing how scores of American men and women came over to help me by giving of their time and money. I had a very difficult campaign, but with the help of my American friends and with the astonishment of everybody, I was elected to the Congress of the United States.
So in 2008, very soon after we had started SADA, I had the opportunity to meet with Congressman Son's grandson. He's the one that's sitting in his lap in this photograph. And he lives in the Bay Area. And when I met with him, I was, of course, very interested in learning more about his grandfather's life and his story and his personal connection to him. But I also wanted to know more about his archive, what happened to all of his grandfather's materials. And what he told me was that in 1962, so just 3 years after this interview we just watched, Congressman Son suffered a debilitating stroke. It left him barely able to speak, unable to walk without assistance, and forced him, of course, to give up his professional and political career. And because of the very sudden and tragic way in which his career ended, there wasn't very much thought, understandably, into what would happen to his archive, to all his materials at that time. And so they were very hastily boxed up, and they were sent from one family member's house to the next, from Riverside, where he lived, down to San Diego, finally ending up with his grandson in the Bay Area. And what he told me was that he had 6 large boxes full of his grandfather's materials sitting in his home, but at that point he hadn't been approached by any other archives or institutions wanting to take these materials on. And as I was talking to him, what really hit home to me was about how close we were to losing such an incredibly important story, not just from the South Asian American community, but of American history, and about how many other stories there are like it, waiting to be heard and in danger of being lost. So that's the work that we've been doing. But I also want to talk about a personal connection to the story. I think, my parents immigrated from India in the late 1960s. I grew up in Michigan. And I think myself, like many other young South Asians at that time, and even to this day, to be frank, didn't have access to our own community stories. And so for me personally, to learn a story like that of Congressman Son or these early stories of South Asians in the United States has been personally transformative. And part of my hope is through the work with SADA that we're able to share that transformative aspect of the work with others. And so to help kind of think more theoretically about what that means, Michelle Caswell, who many of you know is the co-founder of SADA along with myself, and her students at UCLA have been kind of theorizing and thinking about this question. And the terms that they use to describe it are as symbolic annihilation, and the flip side of that, representational belonging. The idea of what it means to not see yourself reflected in the historical record, and on the flip side, the ways that it can be liberating or empowering to begin to see yourself reflected. So there's 2 citations that I'll share here, but Michelle and others have written more extensively on this as well. But certainly after the last presidential election made it so clear, I think, the current political and social climate in the country, and certainly regardless of where you fall politically, one has to admit that the role of immigrants in American society is being questioned and in many cases demeaned. I think that the work that SADA does has a much more a much more direct and important and immediate impact. And that's in thinking about the ways that archive, that storytelling, that history can speak to our current moment and help illuminate, can help clarify, and help create a more inclusive future. So what I want to do is to share some projects that we've been working on that aim to do that, to give voice to those who have otherwise been marginalized from our historical and contemporary record. One project that we launched a few years ago is called the First Days Project. And this project, we collect stories from immigrants and refugees about their first experiences in the country. This is slightly outdated. We've actually collected more than 450 stories so far. And these stories, actually, we allow stories from anyone from any part of the world who's come here for any reason at any time. And these stories really, through this massive stories, you get a sense of the experience of what it's like to leave behind everything that's familiar and come to a new place and make that your home. So I'm going to play for you a short clip of one of the storytellers. His name is Ali Khatau. He came from Lahore in Pakistan to Fayetteville, Arkansas in 1980 when he was 21 years old to go to school there, to go to college. And this is a short clip of his story about his first day.
But the first day when I arrived, it was, I don't know what to say, but it was very, lonely. You don't have the people that you have been growing up with, your friends, your parents, your sister, brother. And then you come over, and then suddenly it's a different environment, and you don't have a single friend. I mean, zero, zilch. You're starting with a blank slate. And I create friends very easily and all that, but that was, loneliness was the number one. I mean, if you want me to put it all in one word, initially the first day was loneliness, because you don't have anybody to count on, you don't know whom to ask for advice, and you don't know if they're going to give you the right advice. It was very interesting. It was different. It was, I think, helpless and loneliness were the two words that I would put the experience into. The first day. Now, ask me what, after a month, oh my God, I was a party animal.
Another project that I want to highlight is one that we launched last year called the Road Trips Project. And for this, we were really inspired by thinking about two things. One was that in February 2017, an Indian immigrant in Kansas was murdered by a white supremacist in a bar. He was having a drink after work with a friend of his. And his name is Srinivas Kuchibhotla. And right just before he was shot, this person said to Srinivas Kuchibhotla, "Go back to your country." And just a couple months after that, in a town in Washington State, a Sikh man was washing his car in his driveway, and a masked person walked by and shot him, saying the very same thing, "Go back to your country." So this is a refrain that we hear again and again, particularly during hate violence directed at people of color, immigrants of color in particular, and certainly at South Asian Americans. Hate violence that's been happening, as I mentioned with the Bellingham riot, for more than 100 years. The other thing that we're thinking about is about the imagery of the open road and how the road trip is such a powerful way of how we think of our country and the possibility of just getting in your car and driving across the country, and what it means for people of color to not feel safe to be able to do that. So what we did is to try to flip that on its head by collecting and sharing stories and images of South Asians traveling across the country on road trips. This is a map that shows the routes that people who submitted their stories, we've collected about 100 so far, traveled as they went across the country. Here are some of the photographs, as you can see, and I won't get to talk about these in detail, but these stories are really incredible in the ways that they touch both on individual memories, but connect those memories to what's happening in the country today. And a final project that I'll highlight is one called Where We Belong, Artists in the Archive, another project last year as well. One where we worked with 5 contemporary South Asian American artists who reimagined and remixed materials from SADA's archive to create new artistic works. One piece I want to highlight is that of Zain Alam. He's a young musician based in New York and Boston, and he was really drawn to his home movie footage we have in SADA of Charanjit Singh Dhillon, the person you see on the right here, who immigrated to Oklahoma in 1959. So Zain Alam, he grew up outside of Atlanta. He was a child of Pakistani Muslim immigrants. And so obviously his upbringing, his life is very, very different than that of Charanjit Singh Dhillon. But in these silent home movies, he saw something of his own childhood reflected in them. And also I think he was taken by how unusual it was to see home movie footage, moving image footage of Indian immigrants in Oklahoma, of all places, in the 1950s. And so what Zain did was edit this home movie footage together, create a soundtrack to it, and then juxtapose more contemporary newsreel footage with that. I'll just play a very short clip, a 1-minute clip of that for you to see what it looks like. So as you can see, what Zane did was juxtapose Russia footage about anti-Sikh, anti-South Asian violence that had been happening with this home movie footage, creating a vision of this kind of pluralistic and tolerant America that Charanjit Singh Dhillon had come here in the 1950s, and the ways that it promises perhaps not been kept to him. Finally, a project that we have coming up now is one that's been supported by the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage in Philadelphia, where we're going to be creating a walking tour and sound tour of historic Philadelphia that focuses on South Asian American history. So there's incredible stories of the most historic parts of Philadelphia, a part of the city that we often imagine of being old white guys in powdered wigs. But there are women, there are people of color, there are indigenous people, there are South Asian Americans in those very same spaces. And what this tour hopes to do is to help people reimagine the past. And like I said, generally that's, I think, more broadly the work that SADA tries to do, period, is really think about ways to engage and reimagine the past to create a more just, inclusive future. So thank you all very much.
My name is Johan Kugelberg. I'm a first-generation immigrant. I moved here 30 years ago. And my first story on visiting to New York, arriving in New York, was that I thought I was pretty good at basketball. So I went to the courts on 6th Avenue and 4th Street to do a pickup street ball game and got hit in the head with a ball 4 or 5 times in 20 minutes. But a week later, I'm thinking that I'm pretty good at chess. So I go to Washington Square Park to play a couple of rounds of blitz, and I get plucked of $50 in 1989 money by a 12-year-old Latino. After that, I realized that I should probably try to live in New York City for the rest of my life, and I've been working on that ever since. After coming to New York, I ended up becoming a record executive and a music writer. And as we know what digital does to archiving, and we're happy about that. But the opposite of that is what digital did to the music business. None of us got salaries anymore after around the year 2000. So I actually had the opportunity to, through a chain of curious events, reinvent myself professionally. I sponsored a kid who had some pretty severe addiction problems, and the only thing that he was really interested in, except for heroin, was hip-hop. And I knew very little about hip-hop. I had grown up in skateboarding and punk rock and nerdy science fiction paperbacks. But hip-hop was a mystery to me, even though I've always had felt a very strong affinity for the art form. So Taylor basically introduced me to the very early formative years of hip-hop culture. And I have OCD on this shoulder, I have ADD on this shoulder. We can choose which one is the angel, which one is the devil. Sometimes they talk. So I wanted to learn as much as I could immediately on the formative years of hip-hop culture. And I discovered that there was very little out there at that point. There were some rudimentary websites. There had been an exceptional museum-quality exhibition in Seattle at the Experience Music Project, and there was a publication. There's been like a smattering of scholarly music anthologies reissuing materials. But the thing that was shocking to me was that as of yet, there was no serious institutional collecting presence in preserving this narrative. And this is, I guess, about a little bit less than 20 years ago, I got hyper fascinated in how universities and museums treat contemporary popular culture, subculture, and alternative culture. So I also started to research the relationships between contemporary subcultures and institutional collecting and how that worked. And with hip hop, I realized that the time to establish a significant archive on the history of hip-hop culture wasn't 5 years from now or 2 years from now. It was now. It was like this minute. It was before stuff ended up in dumpsters, before people got kicked out of their apartments, before people went broke and sold all of their old photographs or whatever it was. It was now. I knew quite a lot through my past in the record business about the nightmarish horrors that have happened in the history of African-American blues, African-American jazz, the history of Latin music, there's the worst horror stories. You know, it was 90 hours of perfectly recorded John Coltrane got lost in a dumpster in the early 1990s because somebody at some record company had forgotten to pay a storage bill. And that's how bad it can get. So I basically started from scratch building this hip-hop archive. And I did it with the sole purpose of having it be a foundation archive for an academic institution. And I spent a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of research doing this, and I actually had the best possible nickname uptown in the Bronx and Mount Vernon and Co-op City. I was known as the ATM. I have found a bunch of old flyers. I'm gonna go down to the ATM and cash them in. I have my late brother's photo album. I'm gonna go to the ATM and cash that in. So the reason that this was important, and of course I got receipts from everybody, and when I could, I would get oral histories and so forth. The important thing about this and the reputation as the ATM was when it comes to a culture that is ruled, you know, face it, ruled uptown by the dictatorship of the new, that it's always about box fresh and new ideas and the next big thing and the next dance or the next DJ or the next MC, the historical remains will unfortunately quite often fall by the wayside. So what was very good with this relationship was that I was always clear with everybody that ultimately this is going to be a collection that is going to be held by a major academic library. And you know, luckily for me, I managed to pull that off, but I'll get to that later. You know, I'm 6'4", I'm Swedish, you know, I'm probably sometimes ridiculous. So at one point, when my son Sam was maybe like 10 or 11 years old, a couple of hip-hop legends had been over in our apartment, and that we had had a meeting, and we were discussing their rhyme books and, you know, how to digitize their photographs and how to digitize some old cassettes. And then they leave my apartment, and Sam walks out of his room, and he looks at me, and he goes like, "Dad, those guys, they do not think that you're down." And I'm like, hell no. By the time they're at the elevator, they're making fun of the way I talk, the way I walk, the way I dress. But my hope is that they believe that my vision for their history is honest and that I am treating their narrative with dignity and respect, even though that narrative will never be my narrative. And Sam said, you know, all right, and went back to his room. I would go up to the Bronx regularly, and to Co-op City or Mount Vernon, and go through old storage spaces. And I had people looking for abandoned storage space auctions. And after this had been going on for several years, I started thinking that this archive was really substantial, that it started having like a real weight to it. So we produced in 2005 a large museum quality exhibition in London, because of course, Great Britain were very, very early advocates of hip-hop culture, and it was great. Streets got shut down, there was breakdancing in the street, loads of famous DJs showed up, and it was a really, really wonderful event. We repeated the same exhibition in Tokyo in Japan, and this landed me a book deal to publish the first of, I've done a lot of books over the years, I'm kind of a hack, but this was one of my very first books, was a visual history of hip-hop in the South Bronx. And then I really was starting to try to get my foot in the door with institutional libraries. You know, it's like Gene Kelly in Singing in the Rain, when he like knocks on the door and goes, "Gotta dance." And the door got slammed in my face surprisingly and shockingly often, I must say. I went and saw pretty much all of the major research libraries, and some people said that, yeah, they would take the stuff. They would take the stuff if it was free, and preferably if I wrote them like a big old check so that they could organize it on the back end and all that kind of stuff. One of the most famous research libraries in the world, which shall remain super nameless, wanted the archive enough to invite me up for a tour. So I went up for a tour, and I was walking in these like strange underground corridors. And then I look at like a pile of cardboard boxes sitting over on the wall on the right. And it's probably already clear what I'm like. So I get down and I start rifling through the boxes, and it's illuminated manuscript pages. Not very good ones, like really kind of dinged ones, a little bit later, like 15th, 16th century, not A-list ones, maybe not even B-list ones, but nevertheless, illuminated manuscript pages. Then I'm like, illuminated manuscript pages, hip-hop flyers and photographs and cassettes and vinyl, maybe this isn't the right fit. Maybe they're not that excited about who I am and what I actually do. And then I happened to meet Catherine Reagan, the head of special collections at Cornell University, who I also teach a yearly class with at Rare Book School, and Ann Kenny, the head of the Cornell Library at the time. And we immediately started a dialogue about community, about symposiums, about workshops, about digital outreach. And I'm very, very happy to say that this was the perfect storm. Everything came to pass because the support of Cornell University was so genuine and so powerful. The head of the Friends of the Library at the time is a super legendary rare book dealer called Stephen Lowenthal, who is one of my best friends and has mentored me for the last 10, 12 years. And he got it. This is a guy who has handled First Folios, who has handled the single copy and private ownership of the true first edition of Dante's Divine Comedy. He's like that guy. And the moment when I showed up at Cornell with like hip-hop records and Polaroids and flyers and cassette tapes, Stephen was like, this is great. We have to do this, we have to have it, and we have to support it. And the way that he quote-unquote sold it to the rest of the university was contextualizing with the history of country blues and urban blues, the history of New Orleans jazz, the history of big band jazz, post-war R&B, civil rights, black power, African-American cultural identity, and then hip-hop. And what Stephen furthermore realized was that hip-hop was maybe even more ephemeral than these other materials, because as we know, the culture did come from around the same 5 city blocks in the most broke part of the Bronx. Transient living, a culture that was ruled by the dictatorship of the new, and a culture that was about Saturday night. And when Saturday night hit, nobody remembered last Saturday night. Nobody remembered who performed because it was next Saturday night. It was about box fresh and new. So the support was absolutely extraordinary. Hip-hop is truly fascinating because of this. The founding fathers consisted of fewer than like 100 people in about 2 different neighborhoods in the South Bronx, spanning maybe 10 blocks. And then this culture, 40, 45, 50 years later, functions simultaneously as global grassroots activism. You know, you go to any town in the world with more than 50,000 people in it, people will be making their own clothes, they will be creating their own breakbeats, they will be emceeing, they will be painting graffiti, they will be performing, they will be dancing. And, you know, on the flip side of that, it's also abject, mainstream, terrible music. And there's no contradiction between the two. So, documenting these kind of narratives for scholars, academics, and fanboys and fangirls to utilize is the work that I do with Boo-Hooray. And I wear several hats. Boo-Hooray is, you know, I often say that we're like too broke to be a non-profit. We're like a non-profit, a no-NE profit. But we have organized and placed around 120 cultural archives, ranging in selling price from nothing to a couple of $1 million. And we have developed relationships with a variety of special collections, librarians, and scholars, and professors, and academics, and all kinds of absolutely wonderful, super cool people who I truly feel are on the front line for a democratization of cultural narratives that I think is happening in real time. And when we're at our most depressed about current events or about people staring at their smartphones or what's going to happen to culture that's born digital, I think that we should still focus on how lucky we are that things survive. I can be ultra bummed out about the 90 hours of lost John Coltrane. I am ultra bummed out about that. But then I got a call from an old record executive about 1.5 years ago, and he was like, oh yeah, we just found 50 hours of Coltrane. And that was how that amazing Coltrane reissue from '63 that just came out a few months ago actually germinated. Boo-Hooray acts as a active and immediate middleman. And it's unbelievably fun work and sometimes unbelievably strenuous work. A few years ago, I got a call from the founder of the Living Theater, Judith Malina. This was 4 days before the Living Theater, which was a radical anarchist theater group that formed in 1946, were going to be evicted from their space on the Lower East Side. So she goes, help. So we have 4 days to show up and empty this basement out and do what I usually describe in my class as guerrilla archiving, where you're just trying to stabilize as much of the materials as quickly as possible and get them to a space where they're safe. 2 days into this sort, Tom Walker, and also one of the founding members of the Living Theater, who, if I remember correctly, got arrested performing in the nude at the Yale Theater in 1968. He was that guy. Says, oh yeah, we have a storage space in Trenton, New Jersey, and I don't think we'd paid rent on it for 10 years, and that's where we put all the stuff when we moved to Italy in 1978. So I'm like, oh brother, I think was the term that I used. So then we actually have to hightail it to Trenton, New Jersey, and the woman who owned this storage facility, which was a space where they actually built B-52s during World War II, liked Judith. So even though they had 5 years of unpaid storage bills, she had let everything stay. So then we had, another 1 million documents and photographs and posters and letters to sort. During Occupy Wall Street, I went down there pretty much once a day. Not because I was particularly down with the proverbial kids in like a sexy grandpa kind of way, or that I necessarily agreed with everything they did or everything that they said, but I felt very, very strongly that I wanted to show solidarity with kids who did their first conscious political act in their lives. And what I could do as sexy grandpa was bring down a bag of apples or a stack of pizza pies or a roll of $20 bills to, just sort of show that this is great, this is okay, this is important. But the reason I'm telling this anecdote is that the email and the text message and the phone went warm from special collection librarian friends from all over America. We're like, hey, Johan, could you pick up a few copies of the zines, or maybe you could pick up a few copies of the posters and send to us, or if there are any other publications, or any badges or anything like that. So you can see how these things happen in real time. My friend Richard Ovenden runs the Bodleian Library at Oxford, which is arguably one of the greatest libraries in the world. A personal, super fanatic fanboy interest of mine is radical anarchist thought during the English Civil War. I'm completely obsessed with it. Christian anarchism in the 16th and 17th century. I hope to write about it before I die if I get a little bit smarter. And the Bodleian has the best collection in the world, because in the 1500s and 1600s, their librarians collected pamphlets and broadsides that were actually insulting them in real time. There's a famous Christian anarchist broadside that describes Oxford and Cambridge as the two eyes of the Whore of Babylon. And Oxford and Cambridge collected these materials anyway because they knew that they were really significant items. And this is the reason that we know as much as we do about radical thought during the English Civil War. Richard is surrounded by people at the Bodleian Library who are still not sure whether the Beatles have any lasting historical importance, which is also pretty cool. A lot of my historian buddies say this one line to me quite often that goes, "It's too early to say for certain." The diaspora of the subject matter is that the people who are uncertain are just as important. The people who say, maybe we shouldn't collect punk rock. Maybe punk rock isn't that important. Maybe time will tell. Obviously, the downside of that is that stuff will disappear, and then it's gone. I'm grateful for these institutional libraries, all of the seed keepers who are on point and on the ball for collecting in real time. You know, this means that the materials will be preserved, and maybe the time will come for the Met to do their major hip-hop show in the year 2047, and not the year 2017. But when that happens, they can borrow the archive from Cornell. Thanks, gang.
My name is Brian Weimer. I'm a local filmmaker and clown and I don't know what else. Apparently I'm a wizard. I lived in Charlottesville for about 20 years now. I used to work in advertising in New York until it stole my soul, so now I'm trying to buy it back. Let's see. This is going to come up here. So I worked on a project. That you'll see in a moment. Oh, there it is. You can see the rest of my desktop too. It's really interesting. It's called Charlottesville, Our Streets. And it wasn't my claim to say that this was the only story that happened. A little background. For those of you who don't know what happened in this town, last year, August 12th, there was a rally that turned deadly. And at being a filmmaker here, I felt an obligation to bring my camera. I actually showed up in a straw hat and American flag shorts. I did not wear the helmet that everybody else brought. And I didn't know what I was going to find, so I just rolled my camera. And as the events of the day kind of carried out, I realized that more and more this was not your average day in Charlottesville. I was about a block from the accident site, or the crash site. It's not an accident. And I know a lot of people who are down that street. I'll show you just the teaser first for what this is, so you know a little bit of what I'm talking about. Let's see. Where are you? Full screen.
You will not replace us! You will not replace us! You will not replace us! You will not replace us!
Everybody has their right to speak. But if you start to loot and burn in my town, we're going to kill them.
So a lot of this was an attempt to tell in very real time what transpired. Right after the events, there was a lot of speculation as to what had happened. There were pundits on television supposing, what the intentions of different sides were. And having been here, I felt there was an obligation to try to get the story straight. So what we set out for was an objective telling, almost just a real-time timeline of the events. And a lot of people said we couldn't do it. We actually were aligned with the Virginia Film Festival, which was in November, and they said, can you pull something together by then? So I pulled together a team. We took 2 months. We crunched through all the footage that we could get. We interviewed 40 people who were there, and we premiered at the Virginia Film Festival in 2 months. Was it the objective retelling we wanted it to be? I don't know. That's debatable. But I think that the important part was, in this attempt to make this archival account, was to remove ourselves. I mean, what's the white guy doing telling the story about this event that had so many other, that was about race, that was about religion, that was about ideologies, and was this just going to be my vision? So I very much tried. We got a lot of different people on our editing staff and on our production staff who could take me to task if I wasn't being objective about it. The other part was to try to break down this narrative. There's a narrative nationally about this that wanted to be very simplistic. That there were two sides, it was this and that, good and bad. And it all depended upon what your own ideology was going into this as to what that narrative might be. And what we discovered in looking at the footage was there were a lot of narratives going on. And so one place was to try to find corroboration between sources, between opposite sources, to find out if something really happened. One was to ask if there was either photographs or video of this thing happening. If somebody said, well, somebody got beat up over here, well, show me. And in that process of searching for those things, we found some really interesting stories, and I've got a clip of one that I'll share with you here that illustrates that point pretty well.
I was right across from this one guy, this military guy, and I was just singing. At one point, he looked at me, and he did like this with his head, and he mouthed the words, "Thank you." And I was shocked.
And I could see the guys that I were with, kind of mouthing along, and I found myself singing too.
It just felt to me like, okay, what goes around can come back.
What was fascinating for me about that experience, and that was an interview with a woman who's an activist here in Charlottesville and a guy who's a member of the 3 Percenters up in Pennsylvania. And they both, unsolicited, told this very same story. And to me, it broke down the narrative. The narrative that there was no connection between these. Even the point, there's a whole other story about who that military guy is and what the 3 Percenters are. But that there was a moment, because of this shared song, because of whatever, that here were these two different factions agreeing on something, and that it was a piece of music. And at the end, when they go into some of their conclusions, that guy with a hat kind of talks about the necessity for trying to find common ground. And that in order for this narrative to have any solutions, that people do have to kind of come together and find a commonality. The other part within this, originally, we weren't going to do interviews. We were just going to show clips. And it's kind of fascinating now. Everybody's got one of these. And the amount of footage that we got, and we left a lot on the cutting room floor, kind of showed that there's no privacy anymore. If you're going to do something in public, it's going to be seen. We had a notion at some point to use security camera footage, whatever. We didn't end up getting that. We didn't necessarily need that. But, and there's a clip that I'll show you in a moment that is kind of fascinating because it's shown from about, I think, 6 different cameras, a particular moment when really things were getting bad downtown. And it was a strange place to be. It was very surreal. Here is, our downtown with, it's a fairly pedestrian space and nothing really happens. That turned into a war zone, that somebody fired a gun 5 feet from me. I didn't even know he had fired it. I was trying to focus on something else, and I heard a pop, and I looked up from my camera, and I realized actually after looking at it that I didn't get in focus what I was hoping to, but I got in focus a guy firing a gun. That something very strange had happened, and that was also our realization that we were at some sort of a watershed moment in, I don't know, or at least our recent history, and the fact that Charlottesville keeps on coming up in the news. And when you get on a plane now and you tell people where you're from, they have a point of reference. I'm going to share this, and it's kind of funny. I've looked at this whole event probably at least 100 times, and I'm probably getting some sort of I don't know, some sort of a syndrome out of it, because it was enough to witness it once. It's the problem with taking on a project like this. Next time I said I'm going to do a movie about puppies. Actually, when I made that comment at the Q&A after we originally showed it, somebody even took that to task. So here's this, and this really gives a feeling for what it was like, and then I'll just discuss a little bit of what this clip also means.
And what they started to do is they formed shield formations, they formed a wedge, they left the park, charged at people, retreated by going up the other entrance. And they did this for about an hour. You fucking
member of my church was punched full in the face in front of police officers, went up to them. That man assaulted me, got the palace guard stare.
Anybody who says that there was no stand-down order is being incredibly deceitful.
So what I find interesting, I mean, I make other films and other documentaries, and that's all real time. And to me, it shows a couple different pieces. And again, as an archival piece, we didn't know what was going to be done with this, but we figured somebody had better pull all this together and put it in one place at one time. But it shows context. And it shows also escalation. It also shows whether the police, you know, for that full 5 minutes of a street brawl, did anything. It also, right now we live in a world of questionable truths. You have people like Giuliani talking about, you know, well, some truths are not truths, or my truths, or your truths. Talk about fake news. So a lot of it is an attempt to show reality. I think we kind of all live in different bubbles. I've got my Facebook feed of admittedly liberal news and things like that, and I've got conservative friends who have theirs. And we have this growing divide of what our worldview is according to what information we take in. So this was an attempt, and even for me to remove my own liberal bias from it, to say, can I create something that all audiences can view? And actually this has been viewed by conservative audiences, liberal audiences. And somewhat to the film's credit, that most of them find it educational, that they can actually sit back and say, well, let's agree that what we saw is what we saw. Where do we go from there? Another piece within it is that not only are there racial and religious conflicts happening, the ideological ones, there's a growing one that we discovered as we witnessed the footage, that a lot of this was a battle between fascism and communism. A very strange thing. When you look at some of the footage, you see fascist flags, but you also see communist flags. And when conservatives say, well, what about fighting the commies? And my liberal friends say, what are you talking about? I can say, well, let's look at it. What was happening visually there? As a filmmaker, I found a certain responsibility within this and an obligation. I kind of regret it. It was not a fun year. I've taken a lot of crap for it. I've gotten 2 death threats. One of the people working on my film had their brake lines cut. But I hope that it is an opportunity for discussion. And I hope that's what it might be going forward. This is one of many. A lot of people are doing documentaries with a lot more production value. We had the opportunity here of being the local people and trying to get this story as factual as possible. Because I think that discussion needs to be part of this solution, and that discussion has to be based on some agreement of reality. Thanks.
I'm going to open it up for Q&A in just a moment. I did want to first ask our panelists about the outreach part of this panel, what you do to bring your materials and collections to the attention of the communities who created them, and incorporating their cultural frameworks within your work. I don't know if you have sort of comments of your particular practice and how that relates to working with communities.
Speaking about the hip-hop collection at Cornell, what we did was that we fundraised to get a position for an assistant curator whose job is basically nothing but community outreach and creating community outreach programs. And it's been unbelievably successful. I think in the past year, he did like 150 events, which is pretty cool.
For us, I think that outreach or engagement is obviously very critical to what we do as an organization. You know, I think for us, in some ways, it interrogates at its very core, the idea of what it means to provide access. When we started out, I think for Michelle and myself, one of the thoughts that we had was, oh, well, our responsibility is to make these materials accessible. We'll put these materials online, and then how they get used is really beyond the scope of what we do. But as time has gone on, certainly in the last 10 years, it's become very evident that access really goes beyond just putting things online. It's really about how you make those histories, those materials, those stories relevant, how you make them part of everyday conversations, how you make them part of people's lives. And so many of the projects that I highlight really are about that, of thinking of how these histories, these stories are about the present and about the future.
About half of film production work is distribution. As much effort as we put into making this movie, you probably have to do at least as much, if not more, to get it somewhere. And it really hasn't gone too far. There are a lot of other things that people are interested in watching. But I will say that some of the intention of this was for the Charlottesville audience. And one little anecdote within that, we showed a couple of screenings, free screenings at the Jefferson Center here in Charlottesville. And after it, a parent came to me and said that he and his son had been at the event and that the son didn't want to talk about it for months and came to the screening and finally opened up. And so I think hopefully there was some sort of, at least it's not closure, it's not necessarily even healing, but as an opportunity to continue this discussion of something and whatever purpose, if just making that movie was about that one kid, then it was worthwhile.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to open up the Q&A to the audience. So we have two people with microphones on either end, if you can alert them to your presence.
Thanks. For Brian Weimer, I'm a Charlottesvillian. I haven't seen the film and I want desperately to. Okay. Is it available on DVD or is it streaming, or how is it possible to buy a copy?
Yeah, and I've just been away for 2 months in Europe and I'm kind of coming back to, okay, what are we gonna do with this thing? I believe that we're trying to plan a screening with UVA, another one with the Miller Center, but there have been enough people who have not seen it. So we will arrange some more screenings and we will get other opportunities for people to see it. Do you have a website? There is a website associated with it, but I think it's charlottesvilleartstreets.com. I think if you probably Google it, it'll come up. A lot of this, I mean, because not a cent was made on this. Like the amount of hours that put into it, so all the other kind of attributes when you have a piece like this of updating a website and things, I have honestly not kept up with as I should. I mean, I'm working on a project now about indigenous dance in world culture, so I'm like, okay, well, do I stay on this or can I move on to something else that actually brings people together? But we'll work on that.
First, I just want to thank everyone for your presentation. I thought it was very informative. I have a question about Charlottesville. Can you talk a little bit about the process of how you were able to connect with the community to share some of the tweets and the phone captures and all that? Talk about how you were able to actually do that to bring the movie together.
We had a big solicitation right afterward. I mean, it was about 2 weeks afterward. I had this footage. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. And Guy Jackson Landers, who's a local journalist who had been up on the front lines of all this and had been covering neo-Nazi issues nationally, he approached me and said, I know you were there, I know you got footage, let's do something with it. We started talking to the other people in the film community who had footage. We reached out into the activist community to see what we could get. We put out public calls. I had a couple opportunities for people to come and do interviews. Also, we looked at different areas where we knew we had sort of holes in our own narrative, even to second guess ourselves, and reached out into the religious community and further. And there was a very challenging thing because some people did not want us to make this movie and said, do not cooperate with them, because a lot of people did not want an objective telling. And they said, we want just, you know, what we all think it was, and why don't you go away? And I unfortunately don't react great to that kind of criticism, and I go, well, can we just try to get close to the truth, if there is a truth? And if the closer that we can get, the more collaboration needs to happen. And other people are doing their own projects. Some of them said, like, you shouldn't do it. I said, well, you go do your own. We can all do a project on this. I don't know. But it is an ongoing, we have added little pieces. I went up to New York a couple months ago and added another piece, but you could keep on working on this thing forever. One thing, too, that was important was to keep the scope of it narrow, because people said, well, why don't you talk about what happened before it and then what's happening after? And I'm like, yeah, you can do a 10-part series on this, but it was almost an exercise, and let's just look at the events of that day. And the one thing we did, we just looked at the day before at the torch rally at UVA, and we looked at, there was a candlelit vigil at UVA afterward, and we included that sort of as bookends to allow some of the context, but the rest of it, outside of it, was a lot of assumptions, and we didn't want to go there. We want to say, what can we prove happened?
Hi, I have a question about SADA. In terms of your outreach, we heard earlier from history makers that we're like losing the histories of the 20th century, and how are you prioritizing, or are you prioritizing your outreach to capture the stories and narratives of those elders in our communities? Because I looked at those first days, and the time scale is far shifted to the right, to the more recent history, versus the 50s and 60s generations, where we had a lot of those student associations bringing people over. So I was wondering how you were approaching that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we started SADA, our priorities in some ways were on the pre-1965 period. As many would probably know, the 1965 Immigration Nationality Act is what really transformed American society and made it what it is in some ways today, in terms of allowing immigrants from Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, and other parts of the world to come to the United States in larger numbers. And so my family, for example, came after the 1965 Immigration Act. But as I was talking about in my presentation, you know, a lot of the early histories of South Asians date back to the late 1800s, even earlier than that, in fact. But we have material history from the late 1800s onwards. And so when we started SADA, a big part of our priority was collecting those pre-1965 histories, because those seemed the rarest and most difficult to access. And so if you visit the archive now, yeah, a significant percentage are pre-1965. But one of the things that I found is that it's in some ways even more challenging to tell the story after 1965, because the community gets so large and so quickly. And so you know, to try to reflect both the diversity of the community and the richness of the history is quite a challenge, and I think we're trying to think creatively about how to do that. So the First Days Project is one example where it's a participatory project, so anyone can go to the First Days Project website and submit their story as audio, video, or text. The Road Trips Project is the same way. And so trying to create basically parameters that open up the doors of the archive to community members to submit their stories directly, and that's the approach that we've taken, is really trying to be open and transparent in the work that we do, and make it easy as easy as possible for people to be part of it. Thanks.
Hi, so this question is for Brian. So I was actually there on the weekend of August 12th working with a volunteer rescue squad. I was there for 39 hours straight, 39-hour shift, and I'm one of those people that definitely, if you had told me you were making a movie about this, I would have said, I don't want to see it. I don't want to have to relive through that. And honestly, I stayed in the rescue squad maybe 2 more months before I just couldn't take it anymore. Those events weighed very heavily on me. And so my question to you is, having to relive those events over and over again while you were making that movie, and having people tell you that, you know, they didn't want this movie to be made, how did you manage to keep yourself motivated, and how did you convince others to open up with their stories?
I'm really stubborn. I worked in journalism for a while, and actually part of my motivation for journalism, I married a woman from Yugoslavia, and 6 months after I went to Belgrade on my honeymoon, we bombed it. And we said awful things about the people who were Serbian, but probably not aligned with Milosevic and other things. And I actually followed a guy named Paul Watson who wrote for the LA Times. And I found that the news is not the news. That not only is there spin, some of it is fake news. And to try to really have a handle on what's happening in the world and important things, as crazy as the Balkan conflict is, as crazy as our issues are here, that we have to have a basis in some form of reality. And I didn't want to assert any ego within this. I really wanted to take my name and myself out of it. And re-witnessing it probably was healthy for me, because I think that while I witnessed it, it kind of went into a surreal something else. Now it's kind of sunk into, no, this is, and to know that this is a small fraction of what can happen. That you can tear yourself apart like the Balkans did. And that place became an absolute bloodbath between ideologies. And to know to say that that is not going to happen here, I think is probably not estimating what the possibility of human awful behavior is. And that's what I witnessed on that day. I also saw a lot of wonderful human behavior and compassion as well. And to try to actually give breath to each of those, and the people who volunteered, and the people who, there's a great story within it of a woman who gave medical care in one of the tents, and at one point they brought somebody in, he was bleeding and blinded and whatever, and it turned out this was a Black Lives Matter tent, and the guy was one of the leaders of the alt-right. And at the point when he got his eyes cleared and realized where he was, he kind of freaked out. And she just said, just think of me like Switzerland, I'm just here to help you. And there was a moment of connection there, and it was because of those caregivers that they were able to break that narrative for that individual who could say, you're Black Lives Matter people, you hate me. To say, no, that there's a possibility for compassion within that breaks the narrative. That's where I see hope. And that's why I'm so thankful for the people who did come and were present there and helped support whatever possibility that we want to see going forward with this. So I thank you for being there. I'm glad I was gone this August in Europe when these events resurfaced, but I think it's important for all of us to be present in one way or another in whatever capacity that we have ourselves. I'm a filmmaker. This is what I do. I have a friend who's a musician. He played on that day, and his music comforted others. People gave medical care because they're medical people. So we all do what we can. So that's why I did it. I'm a filmmaker.
I'd like to thank the panel very much. It's always a tough act to be right after lunch. I think you did a great job. Archives are never complete, and I was wondering if each of the panelists could speak to some of the silences in the archives or projects they've worked on, maybe some of the things that they wish they had access to but they didn't.
Garrick Beck, who is one of my heroes, he's the son of Judith Molina and Julian Beck, the founders of the Living Theater. Garrick is the founder of the Rainbow Gathering, which is a yearly hippie gathering that's been going on for almost 50 years, where they do a sustainable version of Burning Man. So they gather like fruit and vegetables and cook for everybody. They build clay ovens to bake bread. They pull in water on vines from like different brooks in the area. And then everybody trips balls and dances naked and does drum circles and does like terrible street theater or whatever it is. I worked on Garrick's archive, which is absolutely fascinating. And one day in the middle of a conversation, he says, an archive traces an arc across time. It shows an act of actions that sets a stage and how those acts mark the time from one era into the next. So after that knowledge was dropped on me, I had to sit down for a few minutes. And what that cured was what my favorite historian, Piero Camporesi, who was the professor of history at the University of Bologna, refers to as the dreadful desire to study. When you think if you only find this one more photographer, or this one more stack of oral histories, or this one marginal poetry publication, then the archive is complete. Voila, fantastic. So then I'll take it from Piero Camporese to Bart Simpson, who in an episode of The Simpsons, Marge is trying to find a moral to a story. And she keeps on starting over and over again. Now, the moral to the story is, and then Bart looks at her and goes, there's no moral to the story. It was just a bunch of stuff that happened. So I am unbelievably grateful for every single archive that is a work in progress. And I'm also happy when there is no end game. And since I trained as a historian, I often, I meet pioneers from the hip-hop movement or people who were involved with the Beats in the 50s, because, my specialty is the post-World War II field. When they are trying to look for meaning in the artifacts that they kept or the records that they kept or what survived, they're like, well, who's going to be looking at this? Then I have to go right back to Richard Ovenden and his buddies at the Bodleian. It's too early to say. We might not know now. We might understand 200 years from now or 400 years from now. But if we don't go out, gather the artifacts in a thorough and methodical way as we see and identify them, then there's nothing for scholars to argue about 200 years from now.
SADA was an archive that was started recognizing an absence, which is that, recognizing that South Asian American histories weren't being systematically collected and preserved by any other institutions, like I mentioned. But I think that, all archives, as you rightly pointed out, have gaps and should be, I think, in a process of constant interrogation, constant looking inward and seeing what those gaps may be. I think that I recognize there's so many ways that SADA as an archive falls short in reflecting the community.
But
For example,
you made it happen, though, which is killer. And then people can build, and it can snowball and continue to build once all of us have gone the way of the dodo. That's wonderful.
I think that's absolutely true. And yet, I think that, if you ever get to this point where you begin to think that you've done the job, like you said, right? Like, and so I think,
soak our silly heads.
yeah. And so, I think, and in some ways, it's important for there to be critiques both from inside the archive and from outside the archive, right? I think that's what is most productive when those outside of any institution, a community archive or not, are able to
External
look
critique, especially critique from the community, is like the best thing ever.
Agreed, yeah.
Even if it's super harsh, it's wonderful because it completely opens the playing field to other directions that the archive can take and other ideas and other manners of how to pursue this expansion of knowledge that is the purpose of all this.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. I agree completely.
There was a section of footage that we wanted to put in the movie and we couldn't. A lot of it is about releases and what liabilities you set yourself up for if you don't have all the releases that you need. There was a guy, Red Mage, on YouTube who had a lot of footage from behind the scenes of the alt-right. And he is an alt-right dude, he was doing Hitler salutes and whatever, but it was kind of fascinating watching his footage and following it. And at one point he said we could use it, but he didn't sign the thing, so we couldn't exactly, so we kept dancing around it. But there was actually at one point when it was after an incident at the parking garage that these guys marched off into the neighborhoods, and a lot of people were saying, well, what the heck are these people doing in the neighborhoods? And the footage that I have has at least this contingent of about a dozen of these guys looking at their cell phones going, where are we? Does anybody know where the parking lot is? And them circling blocks completely lost. And to me, that provided an important part of the narrative. It isn't the full narrative. Yes, there were other people driving around pickup trucks who were harassing people, whatever. This was one contingent that was, I don't think that they were just trying to fool the camera. They were just, this was a dude following them. So there was that one element. And there was an important part within that because we interviewed people from the alt-right. And we were criticized for that, for potentially giving a platform for those people. And so there was a place of trying to get the story right and get all of this represented without trying to provide a platform for those ideologies. So we did try to stick to just their story, not them spouting ideological craziness and whatever. But there's another part too that I want to discuss, that as we were collecting this footage from all these different sources, it was me getting to know those people. And those people are people who have individual blogs and things, and this is this sort of expansion of this archive. And to know what people had and what they witnessed. And there was one moment that was really educational to me. I had been over by Friendship Court where a bunch of 3%ers had started marching towards, and I also run the art park here, and I jumped up in front of them, and I kind of was like trying to head them off, like because they were heading toward the art park, and we had a whole like security presence there to like, okay, don't bring it here. And also they were heading towards Friendship Court, which, if you don't know what that is, it's a low-income development that's south of town, which has a large African-American population. And so here were a bunch of guys, one of them had a Confederate flag, and these people fully armed heading towards that. There was a woman with them who was dressed also in sort of beige, and they were all in camo. And I just thought these guys were jerks. I thought they were neo-Nazis. I was like, what the heck are they doing? And at one point, she had a camera, and she was walking backwards, and she fell off a curb, and she broke her arm. She fell, she was bloody, and actually I felt kind of bad because I didn't have any, I kind of said, oh, screw you, suit you right. I didn't offer to help her, whatever, and the 3%ers all gathered around her, and it created a scene that all of a sudden church people were coming in, police were coming in, a helicopter was coming in around this woman getting aid. Turns out she's an independent journalist. Actually, I used to work with her in New York. She used to be a media buyer at an ad agency that I worked with. And I made a connection with her, and she had been following these guys the whole time too, thinking, oh, who are these neo-Nazis, whatever. She fell off. All of a sudden, she finds that the people that are giving her aid are the people that she thought were the bad guys. And later on, she did a radio show with them, just to find out what they were. A couple weeks later, she was at a rally in New York of a different nature, and she saw her, and somebody had taken a picture of her with these guys, and she was all bandaged up and smiling, and there were these guys in camo smiling. And that picture had been reproduced on somebody's placard, and they were shouting her name. They had drawn a Nazi mustache on her. And it was interesting just to see how somebody can take something out of context and totally turn it around into something that it wasn't. So as I kind of met all these different people who had been involved in the documenting of this, to hear their individual stories of their own story of where it went. Some of them have been doxxed. Some of them have had death threats. Some of them whatever. And so within this, now there's sort of almost this unity of all these different documentarians, and now it's splintering off into other places as we're following the story, and we have a collective understanding of the absurdity of it. It's hard to express that to the greater population of the complexity of this story. But I think as an archivist, and this is an ongoing archival process, and that archive is YouTube, that to try to understand the totality of this also involves understanding the stories of the people who are collecting it.
And so we are out of time, so I'm going to stop you there. If you please join me in thanking our panelists.